Woman in the peach, please. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Lavinia Weissman, and I'm visiting here from Boston. And my favorite metric hasn't been spoken about, which is health. And for me, health is more than health care. And I've started a small informal group right now that's looking at some new issues from a different perspective. For example, it used to be that children in poverty didn't learn because they didn't want to learn. I now hear reports that children in poverty can't learn because they're sick. And then there's a second piece having to do with the condition of real estate, which is environmentally related, that has to do with environmental conditions of housing for ordinary people who can't afford larger homes. And then there's a third concern I have, which the investment world, I don't know if it's begun to tackle, and it's very important to me, as it is to Hazel Henderson, which is why she launched Beyond the GDP in Europe, which is looking outside the GDP at what's going to affect society. So I think there's an investment opportunity here. I get very concerned when I read a Reuters report that 400 hospitals in this economic recession are laying off people and reporting increased profits. I watched a student today remarkably struggle with a CSR report for a biopharmaceutical company called Genzyme. And I'd like to know when all of you can influence improved reporting from biofarms so the children can stop having asthma attacks and epilepsy and autism in the classroom and can begin to learn.
Okay, that's a really broad question. Okay, I'm not even exactly sure what the specific question is. Can anyone handle this?
I don't. Well, I was going to say something general, but we're entering a time when the decisions we make are going to be really hard. Are we going to build more nuclear power plants? Are we going to limit population growth? I mean, we've got a lot of really difficult decisions to make as a global society. And, you know, what are we doing about healthcare is being debated right now. And I don't think anyone's mentioned Copenhagen. That's going on right. There's a lot of really tough, difficult discussions, decisions. Bills will come out of Congress, and it's going to be very hard politically to do the right thing. So I don't have an answer, but it's going to get really hard.
Both on health and housing, you're pointing up issues that simply are not reducible to an accounting metric. There's no way to capture that on a balance sheet. There's really no way to account in a corporate balance sheet for what a corporation is doing in these areas. It's just, and there is a history behind this of attempts going back into the 1970s where there was an attempt, I'm blanking on the name of the guy from Yale, who, was it Dan Estes? Who put together a number of efforts to include these types of metrics, and there was no way to get them captured. And it illustrates a point that I think is very dangerous in SRI, and that is there is an attempt to capture very complex phenomena in our rankings. And there's a danger that issues that are not inherently capturable go off to the side. I think one of the problems that the focus on carbon has, it's a very good thing. People are focusing on carbon. Corporations care about carbon. That's quantifiable. They can capture that in numbers, and it's used as a proxy for environmental performance when it's not. There are a host of other issues. I'm dumping your question on health. You noticed that. But when you are trying to look at very complex phenomena, health being one of them, you have to accept that this has to be captured in prose. It has to be captured in evaluation in critical prose. It can't be captured in a number. I don't believe it can be. So when you ask what are these corporations doing in the fields of health and housing, these are questions you have to ask individually. You have to lobby the corporation on these questions. They're not going to be reported. There's not a general answer to that.
I would just reiterate my earlier perspective that all the different aspects of activism have to come together in some instances. And so, to Peter's point, this is not where you're going to find corporate metrics. But to your point, nor are you going to drop this, right? So where do the two come together? They come together when some set of activists, some may be shareholder activists, some may be others, begin to pressure corporations around considering their impacts on health, on transportation, on population quantity and everything else. You can have a great long list of things, but looking for the corporations to have metrics related to health or shelter, unless that's the specific business they're in, I just don't think that's going to happen. But to your point of not dropping it, there's lots of ways to keep it alive and vibrant.
Before we go on to the next question, I want to give a response to Jan's question a little bit more, if I may, which is that I'm about to come out in a few months with a book about, it's called The Love Skill, and it's for a popular audience about a lot of these issues. But one of the things that's in that book, that Jan and I were both at a conference in Mexico a month or so ago, that brought together leaders from around the world who are trying to end poverty, called the Opportunity Collaborative Conference. A group of us got together there, and I put up this idea. And the reason I did is because as I was on the airplane going there, the Chamber of Commerce had come out against the environmental proposals of the Obama administration. And Steve Jobs had Apple resign, and other companies were resigning from the Chamber of Commerce. And I really felt we needed a new Chamber of Commerce. And that has a different set of values than this Chamber of Commerce. And so here's the proposal that I've had, that I put out at the group, and we were about to launch it, and we decided to wait until my book was out before we did it. But there's 3 stages we'd set up an organization that would be called the Common Good Business Community. And it could be a chapter inside the Chamber of Commerce, or it could be separate, whatever people chose to do. But by signing up to be a member of this group, you were committing that your business's highest priority is the common good. So you'd be making a public statement. The second stage would be if you decided to have 10% of your net profits set aside and solely invested in common good investment firms, companies that do nothing but buy companies and convert them to be stage 3 common good corporations. This is charting a path for how we get out of this mess. And the third stage is when a company decides to not only do number 1 and number 2, but decides to put a cap on its return to common shareholders, cap the return on equity. Now, I don't care what the cap is, as long as they make it public. So there has to be a common conversation about what do we think about this company having a cap of 50%, but the excess over the cap is also permanently set aside and invested in common good investment funds that do nothing but buy companies and convert them to be stage 3 common good corporations. So now people can see a path out of this set of value systems we're in and into the new set of value systems. Now, the reason I think it would catch is because 90% of the jobs in the United States are small businesses. Most small business people in towns give priority to the common good. They're just not getting recognition for it. We would provide them an opportunity to be able to become part of a club that says, I'm giving priority to the common good, and I'm going to reveal how I'm doing it, because most of them don't make a lot of profit. So they'd be happy to expose it. So I think that there's a pathway in the capitalist system to move beyond to a more mature form of capitalism, and I call that the common good business community. Now, do you disagree with that too, Peter? Oh, no.
I haven't read your book.
Yes, over here. Sure.
I think a lot. My name's Larry Furman. I'm a student here at the program. I think a lot about energy and the energy technologies, and we don't know how to do carbon sequestration yet, but a preliminary a demonstration plant in New Haven, West Virginia, I think, it looks like it's about $5 billion per gigawatt if you scale it up. That's just for the sequestration part. A wind farm, according to T. Boone Pickens, who's not an environmentalist, is about $2 billion a gigawatt. So a wind farm is 40% of the cost of just the carbon sequestration part of coal, and you don't need any fuel. But coal adds more to the GDP because the GDP is a measure of cost, not a measure of efficiency. So the more expensive technology, if you can force your customers to buy it, that's better. Which is, you know, it's like the GDP fallacy. So what do you, well, so that's kind of a circuitous way to ask you what you kind of think about ecological economics.
Building bombs also adds to the GDP.
That's right, it does.
Just a quick, this whole sequestration question is one that comes up about every 30 years. And every 30 years, people learn, particularly in West Virginia, that when you have used dynamite or borers to fracture seams, it is very hard to keep what you pump into the ground there. This was called deep well injection in the 70s. There's a huge literature on this. It didn't work in the 70s. I find it almost, I'm trying to think of it would be like finding the magic bean to think that these coal companies have come up with a way to pump carbon and have it stay there. Just the geology just doesn't work. It didn't work then. I don't see.
Is all this talk about carbon sequestration smoke and mirrors for the rubes?
Yeah. In a word.
His question was about the GDP.
Just a quick comment that, you know, the Stern report calls for a price on carbon that will increase to, you know, something like $100 a metric ton. And if we get to that point, the coal industry as a business model no longer makes sense unless it gets government subsidies. Is that really what we want to do with our money? And are there not alternatives that could be funded instead with the same money? So these are important questions that are going to come up very soon. Carbon capture and sequestration is a risk. Nuclear energy is a risk. There's risks in all these choices. And if you look at the worst performers in the Newsweek rankings, just as a quick aside comment, for example, Peabody Energy was number 500. A commonality amongst the bottom 10 is that insiders own something like 0.2% of the shares of these companies. They don't own the company. The smartest investors don't own these companies. Who owns these companies? It's us. You look at it's 75% owned by U.S. financial institutions in your 401ks, in your index funds, and that's exactly the same thing that happened to GM a year and a half ago. The stock was trading for $16 to $18 a share, and it was owned by the same consortium of people who weren't heeding these risks. And as we go to a price on carbon, these companies are going to be liabilities in your portfolio. And so there'll be all sorts of lobbying and pressure to get these subsidies to support what should, business practices that won't make sense otherwise. And that block of ownership, the main point is that that block of ownership is basically, it causes inertia. And if you're, 30% of money today is invested in a passive manner in indexes, that creates a block of inertia for these companies to change.
So I think you had a question early on.
Hi, yeah, I did, and I want to make a comment on this issue of health. I've worked as a public health statistician for probably 20 years now, and we can actually measure health. I think the problem is that we can't attribute it to a corporation. It's a diffuse measure, and that kind of leads into my question. I want to talk about food systems. One of the ways that or food systems are one of these things where the returns are low. And one of the reasons that the returns are low in food systems is because to do it properly, you put your returns into the soil. You put your returns back into the community. And these, like measuring health, are very diffuse returns. So I think to invest, and the way to get high returns out of food systems is to move to a commodity model. That's the way that you can extract wealth out of these systems and provide the kind of performance that investors typically use or typically look for. So I guess my question is about how do we convince investors to be satisfied with returns in the range of 1% to 3%, which are actually what you can produce out of non-commodity-based food systems. And these returns are spread out over the span of, I don't know, maybe tens of years. I think we need a little bit of a culture change so that we consider that a good return on the investment, because the real return is going into the community. And I guess the question that I've never been able to figure out, and I think we all need to think about, is how do you get these returns that are very diffuse put back to an investor so that they'll be incentivized to invest in things like the community and soil?
Well, I'd like to start with an answer. You know, all the questions being asked here are great questions, and you know, this whole field is the world, right? I mean, we could do this for the next week, and we will not run out of great stuff to talk about and think about and work on. You know, the SRI world, which we seemed for a long time to think was simply advocacy, not simply, advocacy, research and screening, and community investing, is now streams of different things. And this conversation can go from how do you build an economy that's going to be sustainable to how can you build an agriculture that's sustainable. The good news is that there are now people thinking about all these questions. The five of us may not be those people. We may just say something about it that will be helpful, but there are actually people working in all these areas. So the question of how we're going to get the whole world to think about only taking a 3% return, I don't think any of us can give you an answer to that. We might try. But we do know that there are now a lot of pretty smart people out there actually seeking investors for 2% and 3% returns to get specific impacts. And that is a very hopeful sign. You know, what started in community development, what moved to microfinance, has now broadened, and you see a whole community all over the world now of savvy investors, fund managers, business entrepreneurs coming together to solve what would be called intractable social, environmental, and economic justice matters. And you will find in that world people that are trying to solve the question that you're trying to solve. So I think you have to bring it down to the nitty-gritty of it, kind of. And you got to say, okay, I want to build a community of people involved in agriculture that are going to take the long-term view, and then go. And I think you'll, you know, I think that you will find collaborators at this point in the slow food, the slow money world, and in the community development funds. There's a new project just up and down the valley here that one of our clients is involved in funding to support long-term sustainable agriculture. So, but I think you got to get down to that and not look at the whole system and just say, what do I want to get done? And I bet you're going to find partners, fortunately, that will join with you today, because all of these ideas now are starting to make sense, and people are taking the risk to try to figure out how to make them make sense. I hope that was at least a beginning of.
I would just, to build on that, Woody Tasch, T-A-S-C-H, has written a book called Slow Money that addresses exactly this question, and you should take that. Your question actually operates on two levels. You have the local, can you create local economies that would support a 1% to 3% return, some number? But the larger question of monocultures, the effects of corporate agriculture on our society, is something else that really investors as institutions and as mobilized forces of institutions can address and should address. There's a fabulous book called Methland. I don't know if any of you have heard about this book. This book you should read. On one level, it's an examination of the effect of methamphetamines on local cultures, but what it really addresses is why there is a methamphetamine culture. And that is because our rural economies have been devastated. There are no jobs in these small towns. Take a look at this book. It's just out in May. But it's a really good question because it does operate at two levels. How do you address it locally? How do you address it nationally with groups like ours?
Okay, I'm going to take one last question that needs to be to the point and that we can answer in 2 minutes.
I was wondering, for somebody who's interested in becoming an investor and not just giving money to a fund or something like that, what resources would each of you recommend in terms of books, films, seminars for somebody who wants to learn about investing and get started?
You just wrote the book.
Actually, I've got the microphone in my hand, I'll say socialfunds.com, which is, I wrote for that organization, and we've got somebody here, it's based in Brattleboro, who you can talk with more afterwards about that, is one really, I think, good source about that, that includes not only news about it, but also performance statistics and resources for sort of understanding what socially responsible investing is. That would be the first place that I would stop, and I don't work there anymore, so I don't no plug in that sense. Yes, CSR Wire includes, it's mostly about corporate social responsibility, but it does include a ton of information on socially responsible investing as well. Thanks, Terry.
Since I don't have a dog in this fight, I'll plug the Calvert website. Domini's website is quite good. These are mutual funds. Pax World has got an excellent website. There are a host.
Well, they're trying to do that too.
They will do that too. But these are very good resources. Cary's books, plural.
But I think that if your question is, as an individual investor, how do I think about how to do sustainable investing from just my own personal perspective? I don't think that book has been quite written yet.
What about one that's not specifically sustainable, but it has really good starter advice that one could apply?
I think the websites that Bill gave you.
The other thing to say is this field is changing so much. Everyone who's paying attention will know that it used to be one story a day you had to read. Now it's probably 3 stories a day you have to read. You have to constantly stay on top of this. So yes, websites like CSR Wire and Social Funds, and the Wall Street Journal's environmental blog, and .earth, and greenbiz.com, and. Where do you stop? So you almost need someone to filter your news for you.
For the community investment area, at Calvert we have a foundation, the Calvert Social Investment Foundation. And we have $320 million invested in microloan programs, low-income housing programs, coffee cooperatives all over the world. And you can go to our website and you can read about all of those and you can learn about all of that, and they'll help direct you to all the CDFIs that are doing those kinds of things.
So thank you. Well, folks, it's 7:30. We promised to come to an end at some point. I think that point has been reached. I'd like to thank my friends and fellow panelists for making the journey here this evening. I'd like to thank Marlboro's Graduate School in Sustainability for hosting us all. I'd like to thank you all for attending and asking good questions, which we've done our best to give helpful answers for. I hope that tonight has sparked your curiosity and your interest, and I hope that together we can find conclusions and next steps to take in this whole field this hopeful field of beyond SRI and into more sustainable investing ways. So thank you all very much.